Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dhar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to our newsletter at vasantdhar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to a new season of Brave New World. So does ChatGPT really understand anything? Or is it faking it? What does it mean to understand something anyway? Excited as we are about ChatGPT and AI, it's incredible how little we actually know about why it works as well as it does, or why it flops as badly as it does sometimes. A lot of research in AI these days is all about why this is the case. Joining me today on Brave New World is Ellie Pavlick, a language researcher at the forefront of AI language models. Ellie is professor of computer science at Brown University. Ellie, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, this is most timely, considering all of the excitement around ChatGPT and all of that. Before we get into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into AI? What kinds of things influenced you when you were growing up? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm one of these people who came to computer science very late. I don't think I was not a techie kid at all. So I didn't take computer science until late college. I think junior year was when I started really taking CS classes. It's funny. So I don't feel like I was influenced strongly growing up. In hindsight, I think I've always been interested in language and things like that, but it's not like I remember any influences as a kid, especially given how sci-fi the world is now. It's not like I had a strong interest in sci-fi or something as a kid. But yeah, I just got into computer science in college kind of accidentally. I think I took a intro class because I was an econ major. I was trying to do some research. I needed to use MATLAB for something. I had no idea how to use MATLAB. I was like, maybe I should take programming. Maybe that'll help me use MATLAB. Then I just loved the intro class. I kept taking more classes and then ended up here. So
wow, yeah. I would not have guessed that. I would have, these days you just sort of feel that people grow up,
yes.
Programming in high school and all that.
Oh,
so
totally.
I just figured,
I think it's changed a lot just because things have taken off so much, but I literally hadn't heard of computer science. I just didn't know what that was at all until midway through college. I had some friends, I think, studying it freshman year. So I vaguely knew that was a thing, but it was something like materials science. I still don't really know what that is, right? There's certain fields but yeah, I think now we just take for granted. I expect my daughter, who's almost 2 now, will get exposed to programming by the time she's 4, right? That just seems like that's the reality of things now.
Yeah. So what sucked you into it? What, and when I say into it, I mean, decide that this is going to be a career, that you were going to get in deep into AI?
I think literally it was just fun. I just really liked those classes and assignments. So I was doing econ, which I love. I liked econ, the theory of it. I thought it was interesting, but I didn't enjoy doing my assignments, right? It was kind of like a chore, and I felt like CS really didn't feel like a chore. I just had fun. You could sink a ton of time into it, and I guess you kind of know how the tech world is. I think this culture is still alive and well, although maybe it's different. Well, no, it's not different. It's a very open, so anything you want to know how to do, you just Google it, and there's tons of forums and there's explanations. It was very few barriers to entry. I felt so it was quite freeing that for econ, that's not the case. You kind of need a textbook and you need to sit through classes. It's hard to self-teach. With CS, you can just kind of do stuff. So it was that was very satisfying. I felt that fit my personality well. I don't like going to office hours and stuff like that. I want to go and work on it by myself. So that was I think I just enjoyed that. The assignments were really fun. So I just kept taking more, and then I started doing research. So there was Chris Callison-Birch ended up being my PhD advisor, but he was at Hopkins when I was an undergrad there, and he took undergrad researchers. So I started working with him just to kind of see what research felt like. And he did NLP. So that's kind of how I got into NLP. It was very opportunistic. It's not like I was like, oh, I've always been fascinated by language and things. And so I knew that was the field for me. It was just kind of like, okay, there's a spot for me here. So I feel very lucky that this has been such an exciting, like it's felt like a better and better fit every year that I work in it. But I don't think there was some master plan. It's just kind of like, this is where these are people who would take me, and I liked the work enough to not leave, right?
Yeah. I mean, your timing was impeccable, wasn't it?
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah, it's crazy. So I started my PhD in 2012, and like I took machine learning, right? Like my first year as a PhD student, and I hadn't taken it as an undergrad. It's also crazy too, because like the students coming into PhDs now, like know more than I did when I was graduating from my PhD, right? So I came in, that was my first machine learning, and we didn't even cover neural networks. Like we stopped at like Bayesian, like Bayes nets. That was like the kind of state of the art. It was mentioned. I think I remember somebody asking a question in the class that was like, are we going to talk about neural networks? And they were like, no, we won't have time to get to it. Like this is this other thing. Some people find it interesting, blah, blah, blah. And then like I joined some reading group during grad school that was starting to look at like restricted Boltzmann machines and like these architectures that no one talks about anymore. And then it was like in 2015, I remember it's like midway through when I like went to ACL, our big conference, and like every single paper was like, there was like this huge shift, and it was like, crap, now I need to learn this stuff because I don't have, like, I had no background in it. My research wasn't on that at all. So yeah, it's just like it was a very odd time to join that, just like slightly before this huge shift. Yeah.
Yeah, how things have changed, isn't it?
Yeah.
And now, you know, people now coming out with PhDs like don't even bother with learning about symbolic AI and sort of traditional machine learning. Yeah.
Totally. I'm amazed I got a job because there was no deep learning in my thesis. Right. So I was like on the job market in 2017. I had one deep learning result, which was a negative result, which was like I had a data set and I wanted to show that the neural nets couldn't do it. I needed Sam Bowman. I had him help me run his MATLAB code to do this like crappy neural net thing. And it was just like, also like the last slide of my job talk was like, look, the deep neural networks can't solve this weird adjective noun composition task. And that was the only deep learning result at all. And I had no idea about anything about deep learning. So like, it was a weird time to be like very much faking it. And then it was like after my PhD that I then rapidly got caught up to speed. And now all of my students, like obviously all we do is deep neural networks, and I feel very comfortable with them. But like that, I think it's weird too for like students who are currently in their PhD, like you think about like, oh, what you do during your PhD totally defines you, when actually like, I think like based on my thesis, I would have no prediction that this is the kind of stuff I would be working on. Like I did some more kind of, symbolic stuff, a lot of training logistic regressions to make predictions about linguistic features and things.
Yeah. You know, so I had Sam Bowman on the show a few months ago, and I asked him this question. I want to ask you the same one, which is like, what caused this sort of seismic change? Because from the outside, it feels seismic. When you're in the community, things are sort of, there's gradual progress. But there has been like this qualitative shift in capability in language understanding. And I asked him, like, what do you think it was? And he said, well, it was sort of serendipitous that this auto-completion task happened to be one that was just sort of at the right level of difficulty, where doing well required you to actually, quote unquote, understand something about the world. And we'll get into what that means. And so it was just sort of serendipitous. I mean, how do you look at this?
Like, I don't think there's some clear watershed moment or even some like clear idea, right? Like that's, I think, something that's probably true of all scientific progress, honestly, but I think doesn't always make it into the public narrative. Like there's always this kind of narrative of like some stroke of insight or brilliance, like, aha, if we do this, like it's alive kind of a thing. But like, yeah, it's like, it's definitely this language modeling. So this predict the next word is a great task. It's hard to say even whose idea that was, right? Because that kind of thing has been really in the fabric of NLP since before deep learning, right? So we had these kind of bag of words models and these other distributional representations and things, that's been around since information retrieval in the late 90s. Like, and so that's kind of a variant of this. Then you had the dimensionality reduction versions of that. That was like closer to what we have. Then you have early word embeddings like word2vec. Those were like predict the missing words. And then so there just kept being these super incremental changes on the same thing. And I agree, it looks more like there's some inflection point right now, but like I think if you look over, it has been something of a steady plod towards this. Like in many ways, it was like every time you basically do a bigger version of it, it gets better. And as we kind of try to build in less, it frustratingly gets better, right? Like as you just kind of leave more up to the learning, it seems to get better. Those trends have been pretty consistent. Like definitely since when I was starting my PhD, those were trends that were often the case, right? So like I worked a lot in like more of a linguistics background, and a lot of what was deeply frustrating for people in that kind of working on that field, and still kind of is you have these good domain specific insights about how language works, and a lot of the work is like try to build this into the model. And consistently, it was hard to show improvement over the models that just threw everything in and said, don't overthink it, just let the model figure out. Of course, they still have weaknesses, and the models we have still have weaknesses, but it has been hard to consistently show that us building stuff in does better, right? So it's basically these two things of like make the model bigger, build less in, has consistently been just doing better. And that's been like almost a steady trend for a long time. And then I think what's shifted now is just like maybe there's some tipping point that once they get even bigger, right? Like we've really scaled them up. I mean, we have seen exponential improvements in the ability. We've also seen exponential improvements or exponential changes in the size of the model. So it's not like, so it's in that way kind of predictable. And then I think the other thing that's made it really just feel like a tipping point is just putting it in the public eye all of a sudden, right? So like so it's funny you mentioned Sam. So I worked with Sam pretty closely in right after I graduated. We did this Hopkins summer workshop thing together, and that was my crash course in large language models, because like I said, I didn't do this during my PhD, so that was like working on trying to basically train large language models before there were large language models. It was a weird workshop because our plan was basically to build a large language model. That was the premise of the workshop. And then right before we started, Elmo came out, and Elmo was like arguably like the first of these. And so then we're like, crap, now we need to try to find a way to improve over Elmo. Like that's kind of what we were going to do, is do something like build Elmo. But then, so it was like, I think it was a really fun workshop. It was like, if we had done it 1 year earlier, it would have been so much more high impact, right? That I think was like I remember that being super exciting, like that model, which looks tiny and not very exciting by today's standards. And so I think anyone who's been kind of paying attention since then has seen this trend happening. But like the public didn't care so much about Elmo. When BERT came out, there were some New York Times articles and things. But then all of a sudden having ChatGPT there where everyone can play with it has like put it out in the public. And now everyone's like, oh, this is what NLP is. This is crazy. And so I think that's just like made the whole field like shine this super bright light on all the research that's happening. And I think that's more of a shift than a technical shift.
Yeah, it's sort of been a triumph of engineering over science, right? It's just been sort of, well, let's try this. Oh, it works better. Oh, awesome. Let's improve on this.
Absolutely. And I always champion for like the basic science. Like that's what I think of. Like that's my personal preference for how to do things. Like I want to understand how they work. I want to run controlled experiments and things like that. But I do think you have to admit that the current like technological progress needs both, right? And this is showcasing how much good engineering, just like you don't need some brilliant scientific insight, but you need some brilliant engineering to put all the things together and then make it useful, right?
Yeah. Last week, Jeff Hinton said something really interesting. He said, that it's almost like an alien species has landed on Earth, but we sort of have a hard time taking it all in because they speak such good English.
Yes. Right. That's a super interesting point. Yeah, because this is something I've found myself struggling with and my students struggling with, is like, we don't have the vocabulary for talking about the way these models behave, right? Because English has, and I'm assuming other natural languages, all the words we have to describe this kind of behavior have only ever been use to describe humans. So all we have is things like think, understand, it's trying to do this, it wants to do this, it's confused. Like we only have these anthropomorphized words because we've never needed words for a non-human thing doing this kind of stuff. I hate to use those words because I'm like, oh, that's so loaded. I don't want to say that it understands. I definitely don't want to say it thinks. I don't really know, but I don't have an alternative word for that. And I also hate jargon. I've been quite conflicted about which is better, using the uncomfortably anthropomorphized words or using some ridiculous sounding jargon. And there's no way to win, right?
Yeah. No, I know. A couple of my colleagues created this thing called ChatDS. Basically, and they interviewed a chatbot to pass a data science interview, and it actually did. And they created this sort of animated thing. And we found ourselves referring to it as he said this and he said this.
Yeah.
Right? So it's really easy to get sucked into that.
Right, yeah.
In prepping for this conversation and reading your papers, it sort of reminded me of a paper I read a long time back by Marvin Minsky, where and it's called, I think it was called like Music, Mind, and Meaning. And he says something, and I think this segues well into your work and how you think about sort of language and understanding. I'll just read it out. So he's talking about meaning, right? So he says, a thing has meaning only after we've learned some ways to represent and process what it means, right? So I realize this is sort of slightly circular, or to understand its parts and how they are put together, right? And now he's getting, I think, at composition. A thing or idea seems meaningful only when we have several different ways to represent it, different perspectives and different associations. Then we can turn it around in our heads, so to speak. However it seems at the moment, we can see it another way, and we never come to a full stop. In other words, we can quote unquote think about it. If there were only one way to represent this thing or idea, we would not call this representation thinking. Right? So what I found really interesting about this is that he seems to be sort of implicitly arguing for a distributed or a neural network kind of representation of things, even though he himself, really put a chill on that whole research agenda, with his 1969 book, showing that you couldn't train a neural net. And so, things, you could only train things that were linearly separable and all that kind of stuff. And yet when I read this, I'm like, he's talking about, implicitly, he really is talking about neural networks, isn't he? Right? When he talks about things being connected to everything else, and you can turn it around in your head, you can see the associations, you never come to a full stop, right? You can always sort of see things in different ways, right?
Yeah, I don't know. So that's interesting because I didn't hear it like that. I mean, something that's so hard when you think about these definitions of meaning is usually people are coming out of it as a product of like the environment they're in when they're thinking about these things. And so when I read some quote from Minsky, I'm like, oh, he's going to be like a good old fashioned AI person. And so I just instantly interpret what he's saying as somehow kind of a advertisement symbolic, or an argument for that, right? Yeah, and so I think like people who did the symbolic AI would say that all of those things are true of symbolic AI. It's like, oh, it's this representation that exists kind of in its own right. And you can if you have some kind of constituent parts that you can recombine and put together in different ways, right? Like I could say a red apple is red apple, but I also can then convert apple to fruit that grows on trees and red to something I know about red. And I can now say red apple is the combination of those two things. And that's what I'm imagining when they're thinking about it in different ways, because I know that that's the kinds of systems that they think are the right systems. But yes, I completely agree. If you told me that quote was a Hinton quote or something, I'd be like, oh, totally. He's talking about distributed representations, right? And I actually feel like this is really hard. We do a lot of, so I teach a course jointly with Roman Feynman, who's in cognitive science, and we teach a course on language processing in humans and machines. It ends up being a lot of kind of this old philosophy of what is understanding, what is meaning. And one of the things we just have to emphasize to the students is how much every time you get one of these definitions, it's like someone's coming with a position and an agenda, right? It's not like there's really a consensus definition. And it's very much like reading a politician's words, right? When they say stuff that sounds general, it's actually specific because they're saying it in a speech that happens to be aligned with when they're introducing a bill or something like that. And so every one of these proposed definitions of meaning is they'll put up some desiderata, or they'll say humans obviously behave this way, and then, oh, how coincidental, they have a theory that fits those desiderata, right? Like it's like, and I think that's what's happening now too. Like we have observations and arguments about how people work, and they're usually coupled very tightly with somebody's proposed system that is human-like or understands or something. I don't think it's a bad thing, right? Like we kind of need this pluralism to somehow, between all this messiness, will converge on the right answer, and that kind of back and forth between competing theories is like how we move forward. But it can make it really hard to, like, when you come at this, like, oh, do models understand? And you have somebody who's building the models and thinks they understand. They're like, obviously, yes. And here's a definition of understanding that supports that. And somebody's like, obviously, no, here's a different definition, or sometimes the same definition, just quoted in a different context. And it's so much to get your head around. It makes it really hard to know what the answer is to these kinds of things.
Yeah. So how do you think about understanding? I tried to see whether ChatGPT understood this sentence. The trophy wouldn't fit into the suitcase because it was too small, right? And I said, what does the it refer to? And it said the trophy. And I was like, oh, I'm so disappointed, And I was surprised, right? Because I just expect so much of ChatGPT that I was like, really? Like, how could you get that wrong, right?
Right, yeah.
And
like,
so it
isn't that in your
answer.
Training data?
Yeah. So it gave me the wrong answer, but then it gave me the right answer after that,
Right,
so it was just like, it was confused. And I asked it several times. And then, I went to one of my colleagues, an NLP person, and I said, hey, did you know this? And he said, well, I'm surprised it gets it wrong. Oh, that's interesting. And then he said, have you tried GPT-4? And I said, no. And he said, well, let's try that. And GPT-4 also got that wrong, right? So, so we were like both scratching our heads saying like, that's surprising it gets this wrong, right? So I waited a week. I figured, things change sort of by the day, as far as these language models go. So I waited a week, and yesterday I asked it, and presto, it got the right answer. It said, it's the brown suitcase because, it's too small. And I said,
you tweeted about it?
No. And then I said, are you sure? And it said, oh, you're right. I'm sorry. It's actually the trophy. And I said, oh, crap. This is like terrible. Right? It's just like,
oh my God.
And that reminded me of one of your papers that I read, which is like, it's just not quote unquote grounded, right? It just feels like there's a lack of grounding here, right? That it does know a lot, but somehow it doesn't feel adequately grounded, right?
Yeah, right. It's so interesting. It's so funny with these kinds of things too, because it's like again, this is where like we don't have the words for it. Like we say stuff like, does the model understand? And we have these tests like, oh, if you understand, you should get the right answer on this kind of a question. It's like that's neither necessary nor sufficient for understanding. So like, what do we do with it in this kind of like we get kind of stuck in this weird, exactly what you're describing, where you're like basically the model has this weird inconsistent behavior. And I think that it's a strange kind of reality when we're in that where it's like we have this moving target, like we don't really know what the target is. We kind of propose these evaluations, we test them, we like on the basis of how it performs, we're not quite sure what to make of that, right? Because we're like, well, it's like it clearly knows a lot of stuff. And then, we kind of conjure up new hypotheses. Maybe this is due to a lack of grounding. We can get into the grounding issue in a second. Like I really go back and forth on like what is grounding, how much is necessary. I'm like deeply conflicted about it. Like, I just don't know where I stand on this, as is probably the case for most of these issues. I don't really know where I stand, but I think this is this kind of, it kind of exemplifies what we're dealing with any given test of understanding, right? Is that the, purported test of understanding is that the models, we either get something weird like this, like they totally fail. And then you're like, okay, so like, then you look at all the other things they do and you're like, is the whole thing a sham? Like, is it the case that because it failed on these like edge cases, like they understand nothing? It's a house of cards about to come crumbling down. Like that seems honestly like a ridiculous, like there is this kind of a viewpoint, but to me that seems like a massive oversimplification, right? Like it's not a binary understanding or not understanding. And you either are a human who understands the way we think of as understanding, which we honestly don't have a great model or definition of, but we all have this intuitive notion of what it is. Or it's it's nothing, right? Like we mentioned, I mean, there's probably differences between like, you were saying like meaning versus understanding. I think the Minsky quote was about like maybe meaning or maybe understanding or maybe somewhere in both. But like in some senses, like people might think of meaning as a lower bar, right? Like I could walk in to my house and say, I saw my husband's car here. That means he's home. It does mean he's home. There wasn't really intent. He didn't leave it there to signal to me that he's home. I don't even know that I sit and like mull that thought around and think about it in all different ways. It's just like a cue of something and it has meaning to me, whether it was intended to have meaning, right? There's like that sense. I was talking to like some people who do like literary criticism, right? Like this is hotly debated in English, whether the meaning of a text depends on the author's intent or not, right? Like what I get when I read a poem, does it not mean that if the author didn't mean that, right? Like if I have a different background than the author and they're writing from like, World War I battlefields and I haven't experienced that, can I really capture the meaning? Like this is hotly debated, right? It's hotly debated between humans. So there's this huge spectrum of like kind of what is meaning, and then understanding is maybe something more than meaning, but like I don't think there's like a really clear sense. So yeah, we get in this sense, this conflicted thing where we're trying to come up with these tests, and we can think of tests and they test something, and then when the model succeeds, and then I think we see frustration on both sides. The model succeeds and it's like, oh look, it must understand, and people are like, well no, like you could succeed without really understanding. Or it fails and then people are like, okay, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't understand anything. And so then you're kind of like, wait, why are we even doing these tests? And they're like, it's worth doing. We keep getting these data points, but there's just only so much you can conclude from any one given test, right? And I think some of the kind of debates you see on Twitter or just in the discourse in general kind of come from this, because people are like reading a lot into these kind of single data points and throwing them back and forth at each other, and they're not actually in contradiction with each other.
That's very well summarized, Ellie, putting the usefulness and limitations of all these messy experiments in context and the difficulty of actually pinning down what and how much humans and machines really, quote unquote, understand, right?
Right. And people have been arguing about this forever, right? Since long before models. I mean, there have been thought experiments about these types of models well before they existed. There's like, I love to use in talks, like there's this quote from Descartes, right? Like what machines in Descartes' time were like, I don't know, wagons, like, I don't like, right. And they were still debating, like, what would it mean for a machine to understand and da, da, da. So like people have been arguing about this forever. It's not a new problem, but like with every new technology, it comes to the fore again. It feels very fresh, and the particular way we're thinking about it is different, right?
Yeah. How do you think about all of these issues? I mean, what's at the forefront of your research and inquiry in this space, meaning and understanding?
I'll give an answer, and I think we can get back to the grounding question because I think it's like kind of a good case to have this. I would say like my general philosophy right now, and I've been trying really hard to commit to this, is just that like we should be treating everything as an empirical question right now, right? Like I think it's really easy, and we've seen this throughout this history of this kind of debate, to like we have such strong intuitions about things, and people don't like to be wrong. And I think sometimes you see kind of like people have like picked a side already, and then once you pick a side, it's hard to switch sides without being like, oh, I was wrong all along. And that's where you can see this kind of dogma forming. I don't want to see NLP become super dogmatic. I think historically the work on neural nets in this debate about reasoning has become quite dogmatic, to the point that people like won't publish in each other's journals and stuff because you're just going to get rejected on the basis of the theory you're using, right? I don't think that's good for science. So like I think getting like super wedded to definitions this early on, super obsessed with kind of being on one side or the other this early on it's just a mistake. We just know so little about what's happening. So I've been just trying to say like, right now I have my thoughts about things and talk about like if I had to place a bet now, here's how I think this and that'll happen. But I really would like to be able to like 5 years from now publish stuff that just completely rejects the stuff that I'm currently putting out, and then 5 years later flip back. Like I think being a flip-flopper should be a good thing in science, right? Like that's what you do when you read the data and commit to it. So I think that's my general feeling, has been to just try to really think about what is what is the hypothesis? How would we test it? And then be honest about what the data shows, and then change your mind if the data goes differently, right? Like, I think that's how I've been trying to approach things, because I just honestly don't know. Like, these are just such huge questions, and things are changing so rapidly, and we know so little about so much. So it's a hard time to feel like, like you can really form opinions about these things.
Yeah, hard time, but tremendously exciting.
Super exciting, yeah.
Time as well, because, like I was saying earlier, things just seem to sort of improve by the day. There's a couple of things I want to touch on, and, in no particular order. So let's just start with this notion, and you touched on this earlier, that as we make these things bigger and bigger, they just get better and better, right? Dirty little secret that scale tends to sort of triumph smarts, if I were to sort of oversimplify. So explain to us what these scaling laws are that Kaplan et al. Describe, and what they imply.
Yeah. So we can talk about kind of what they are, and then what they imply, I think, is harder. So the original result, so the thing we typically use to measure language model quality, like during training, is something called perplexity, which is just how good is it at anticipating the next word, right? And so that the scaling laws were really shown with respect to that, right? Predict the next word in a sentence over a large amount of data. And what they showed was that as the models got bigger, you could project out how much better they were going to get on perplexity. And then when they trained a much, much larger model, it like exactly fell along this curve. So it was like there's a predictable trend where as models get bigger, they get some amount better at predicting the next word. It's not like a law of nature, right? So I've heard sometimes the analogy to like Moore's law, right? Like Moore's law held for a very, very long time and then kind of stopped holding, right? So it's not like we have some like provable law of nature that says it has to be the case that as language models get bigger, they'll get better. It could be that if we double the size of the model, again, they won't necessarily get this much better at perplexity. And there's definitely like a hard bound on the optimal perplexity, right? Like there's only so good you can get at predicting the next word. Like you can't get perfect at it. There's some inherent ambiguity. So that's what the scaling laws just showed, was that as the models get bigger, they get predictably better at this perplexity. The kind of, I would say the interpretive part of it or something is that as they get better at perplexity, they get better at all the other things that we're actually using them for, because very few people are using them to predict the next word. Like really, right? Like that's technically what they're doing, but we're using them to do tasks. We're like, hey, write my email, or tell me what stocks to invest in, or how do I improve my blood sugar, whatever, asking them questions and using them to do tasks. And those things aren't how good they are at those things isn't really measured by perplexity, right? It's measured by whatever other metrics we use. And so there's this other assumption, which is like, as models keep getting better at perplexity, they're going to keep getting better and better at these tasks. And that also includes tasks like doing science, right? Like people are talking about like using language models to mine the human genome database and predict new cancer drugs or something. Like there's no particularly known relationship or no particular reason why getting better at predicting the next word should equate to like anticipating a cure for cancer. But there's like this feeling that somehow as they get better and better and better at perplexity, and saying like, oh, we have scaling laws, we know they're going to get better at perplexity, then they're also going to get like proportionally better at these other things. There's no like law that shows that is the case. There have been correlations shown between perplexity and other kind of language task performance. And then empirically, it does seem as the models get bigger, they're also getting better at these other tasks. So I think scaling law is like, it's a strong empirical prediction. It's not like a law of nature yet that we know. But I think there's a lot of theorists probably working on trying to get something more rigorous. And it's this kind of thing where it's also somewhat of a observation that there's this correlation between getting better at perplexity and just being like these general purpose AIs is what people are like trying to think about, whether we're looking at something like AGI, and that's being debated too, right? So it's a conflicted topic, I think.
Yeah, I think coming back to Hinton's example, I guess that would mean that they speak better and better English, and they quote unquote understand the world better to be able to not just speak better, but actually converse better, right? That they can sort of converse more quote unquote deeply about
Right.
things.
Right. Although I think I'll just like channel a devil's advocate. Like this is where like if you take the stochastic parrots kind of a viewpoint, it's like predicting the next word isn't like getting too good at that could almost be a bad thing, right? Like I don't think humans are that good at it. Like we're pretty correlated with language models and like we're surprised by similar types of words and things like that. But like I hope that I can't predict the word you're going to say 200 words out from now. Like, because I don't know where this conversation is going. And like, actually, perhaps the ability to do that would somewhat run counter to like your ability to be creative and generate new ideas and things like that, right? So there's some, again, I think everything's up for grabs. I don't think there's any like inherent reason why being better at predicting the next word should map onto something like general intelligence. Although empirically, we do see a really strong correlation between being good at predicting the next word and being really, really good at that and doing other things that that seem to be different from predicting the next word, like solving general tests.
Yeah, sure. And I guess bigger doesn't necessarily mean that the same model needs to understand everything, right? I mean, you could have a model that converses incredibly well, speaks great English, as Hinton says, and converses and can even be a Rogerian therapist, but that doesn't mean it's going to be, the best, researcher in genomics.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's another topic that's kind of become open for debate, right? So like people talk about AGI, that's been like the phrase, but like so humans, we don't have a model for that, right? Like humans are not experts at all the things, right? And that's arguably our strength, right? Like we're generalist in some cases, like we can converse about lots of different things and we can transfer to different contexts, but like the same person is not simultaneously like optimizing bureaucracy in every country in the world and finding the cure for cancer and building new AI models and also telling you how to best irrigate your crops to maximize eco-friendly efficiency and health and whatever. Like one person, probably there's a biological reason that they couldn't do all those things. Like even people who we think of as like, oh, they can do it all. They can do like 4 things well and we're amazed, right? It's like, oh, they're a good cook and they speak 4 languages and they're CEO of a company and like, wow, right? And but we're asking language models to, like, people are expecting them to do all the things. So arguably they're not like replacing a human, or they're not trying to map human intelligence. They're trying to match like society's intelligence. And it's an open question whether a single system, whatever that means, can do that. I think that's where a lot of skepticism comes from, is that how could predicting the next word possibly be enough for that, right?
Yeah. Fair enough. And while we're on the subject, right, there's a paper that I came across, and we sort of discussed this briefly by email, claiming that there are certain capabilities that only emerge at scale, right? That these small models aren't capable of something, and that capability emerges with size. So, for example, models need to be sufficiently large or complex to understand humor, and even larger to understand sarcasm. How do you think about this emergence of these more advanced or nuanced kinds of intelligence requiring scale, just requiring larger models?
Yeah, I mean, so I both like very much like it and also don't like the kind of framing and discourse around it. So I think I agree with, and I agree with you, is very intuitive, is that there are certain skills or capabilities or behaviors, well, that are learned and that have a lot of prerequisite knowledge to be learned, right? So you can think of something like, if we look at how these models are trained, they have some number of weights they can use to encode the stuff they know, and like knowledge takes up space, or like these different skills take up space, like they need to be there in the parameters and things. And there's also someone as an architectural problem that they have, but also just the way they're built, right? Like they kind of unfold over the layers, right? So like if you're going to need to, at layer 24, know something, know the, president of the Congo or whatever, then before layer 24, you need to know what the Congo is, and you need to know what a president is, and you need to put these things together, right? So there's kind of a physical space constraint on the stuff where stuff is represented, how it's represented in order to be put together in the right way. And it can just take time during training to synthesize these things. So I like to think about this kind of process of learning and abstraction that the models are doing. And we're trying to do work to, show how this kind of stuff happens. And other people are trying to do similar work, right? Where it's like the model might see lots of inputs, and you can just think intuitively about learning. Like if you see a single cat, you're only ever going to learn that thing is a cat. And when you see multiple cats, you might start to learn that it's actually worth having this more abstract notion of cat that can make it more efficient to recognize all of those as cats. Then once you see lots of things, maybe you'll learn the concept of animal. Even more things, maybe you'll learn the concept of organism or living thing or whatever. So you can just imagine that these things there's baked into it a scale component. It takes up space in the model's weights itself. It takes a lot of data to do. You need a model that's large enough. So I totally buy that these things emerge, right? If they are learned, they're learned over time and over space, and the scale gives you more abilities. And if there's some dependencies between them, then bigger models are able to learn more abstract things. They have more layers they can put together. They can learn more concepts, and they can put them together in more complex ways. So I like all of that. And I think that's how we should be thinking about a lot of these things. The piece that I don't love about the kind of discourse around the emergent capabilities is this kind of sci-fi-ish flavor it gets, which is basically these large models have these unpredictable skills such that if we train GPT-7, maybe it's going to pop out as this villain that's going to take us all down, right? And we definitely want to be very concerned about risks of training these models rapidly and deploying them rapidly without introspecting. But I do think that basically, I don't think this emergence is unpredictable. And I don't think if you look at a smaller model, there's nothing in that could anticipate what's going to happen when you double it, right? So I think you should see the emergence of these prerequisite skills, for example. So to me, I think the kind of surprising nature of the emergent abilities is just because we don't understand enough yet. We're still learning how to read the models. We're still learning how to measure what they know. Really, the only measurements we commonly use are performance on a set of benchmark tasks that we've put together. So if you see chance accuracy at, when you're at 500 million parameters, and then you get all of a sudden perfect performance at 175 billion parameters, and you're okay, therefore there was nothing happening at 500 million parameters that could have told us that we would do well at 175 billion. I think that's just because your measurement was bad, right? So I think, and I have seen other work, and I haven't gotten to dig into it, that suggests that this is the case, that under different measurement techniques, you see much smoother learning curves. So I think I don't disagree with the emergence, but I don't like the framing around that being surprising. I think in the next couple of years, we're going to get a lot better at measuring things, and hopefully we could have scaling laws of this type, right? We should be able to say something like what actually would happen for the larger models, so that we would, we can catch it before it's a supervillain, right? But I think that, again, I think this just requires a lot of work, and it just takes some time, right? People are trying to deploy these things really soon, but we're still working really hard on just figuring out how to measure them, how to evaluate them.
Question I maybe should have asked you earlier, on this sort of spectrum of, for lack of a better word, a philosophy of how much you need to prime a machine to be intelligent, right? On the one hand, this sort of philosophical view that intelligence is innate, and on the other extreme, that it's all learned. How do you think about this? Is this a useful way of thinking about training these machines, in terms of do we need to actually prime them with something? You mentioned earlier something seeing lots of cats and dogs, and then sort of realizing that there's this sort of more general notion of an animal. I guess that could be purely bottom up, or it could be sort of, you could induce it as well. How do you think about this?
Yeah. So this is when we're talking about treating things as empirical, right? This is something where I can tell you kind of how I'm thinking about it now. I want to build in so little, right? Maybe this is how computer scientists are oh, as programmers, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to build in anything and we just threw some data at it. And the irony is like finding the data and actually building in very little takes an incredible amount of work. But I think there's like a kind of a philosophical preference in the machine learning world that like the less feature engineering you have to do, the less the architecture design somehow, the better. That's not based on anything. But like right now, I think I like to think about the question as like, what are the conditions under which intelligence, however we're defining that, or this kind of behavior emerges? And like conditions under which it emerges is broad enough to include the only time it emerges is if you have some innate structure there. It's never coming from the data. You have to build it in, right? Personally, I've just not seen a ton of evidence. Like right now, based on the current evidence, I just don't feel like I can endorse that. Like I feel like there seem to be pressures from the data and the learning that are a lot of the stuff we thought we needed to build in, we don't. There's still some stuff the models don't do, and there's improvements where you build it in and the models do better. So it's not like I think we'll never need to build anything in, but like right now I haven't seen any like really clear examples where it's like, yeah, no, that thing, the models just haven't been able to learn it. So a lot of the kind of classic examples from linguistics were things like syntactic structure. That's where the debate was that for a very long time. And we've seen so much success from these language models at modeling syntax that I think it really kind of pokes a hole in that line of argument. And then general stuff about compositionality and things like filler role independence and these kinds of, and those are also things where it's been harder and harder to show that like that really needs to be built into the models. So based on those examples, I'm like, well, other examples, like how do we know that it won't go away with scale? So right now, I think a lot of the question is like, well, if we can figure out how the thing is represented, how it's solving these tasks, and what kind of conditions allowed that to emerge, that tells us a lot. Like, I think this is where getting too tied to definitions can be a hindrance because everyone kind of wants to know, okay, so who was right in the historic debate? Do you need innate stuff or do you not, right? And so then you start getting into these quibbles about like, if you design the learning objective differently, is that a type of innateness? Or if you design a data curriculum, is that a type of innateness? Or is attention, we've put in the attention mechanism, does that kind of like, I don't particularly care, right? But it's more just like figuring out under what conditions does this stuff come about? Does this stuff arise? Does this stuff emerge? And then it could be that there's only one way to do it and it's whatever resulted in humans, or it could be that there's multiple ways of doing it, right? And I think we don't know yet. So yeah, so I think right now I'm interested in the like less stuff built in. Like we're seeing so much success from just the learning pressures of these models that they have some inductive biases, of course. We build stuff into the architectures, of course, but it's much more minimal than what we would have expected. So that's fascinating, and we're trying to figure out what's going on there. If we could take that all the way, that'd be very exciting to me. If it turned out that there was like a information theoretic optimization story for how you get full-blown intelligence, right? But perhaps it isn't, and perhaps we'll find that there's you need some serendipitous architectural something in order to get it. And if so, then fine, then that's the answer, right?
Coming back to this thing about engineering and scale. So is the complexity, the fact that it takes a lot of power, it's expensive to train these really large language models, right? That people are sort of increasingly using stuff that's already been built, like, something that's off the shelf, right? And that seems to be becoming more and more the case. You just sort of take pieces that other people have built and you just sort of, build on top of those. Is this sort of hindering research and progress in some ways because you're sort of limited to, using the stuff that's already been pre-built for you, that you can't really do it yourself anymore?
Yeah, I always would rather live in a world where everyone has the resources to do anything, and also there's like no negative externalities to that, right? Like if we didn't have to worry about the kind of energy costs of everybody trading ChatGPT every day if they wanted to, right? So I do think I'm excited about all of the open source projects that have been increasingly happening. I was involved in this, like Hugging Face led this thing called Big Science that produced this large language model. EleutherAI has been really good at producing and releasing these large open source models. I think that that's good to see. It's true that other people can't build them themselves, but at least they have access to the ones that are built. And that at least now there's some amount of redundancy between the models that have been released, that we can kind of look at a couple different, I think Meta Research has also released some models, right? So you can kind of compare across those. So I don't know. I don't see the situation as dire as maybe some of my colleagues. I think I'm also just kind of an optimistic person in general. So to me, the really exciting research questions are like, how do these things work? Why do they work? And honestly, there's so little we know right now that even just being able to tell a story about how one of them works, a single artifact, would get us a long way there. If we knew how ChatGPT or, whatever, GPT-J, whatever model we're using worked, then we would need more models so we could stress test and say, is this always the case, or do all models work this way or something? But we don't even have a story about that. So I think there's plenty of work to do on these artifacts. That's for a particular type of research. I mean, we definitely need them open source. Like, you can't do that if all you have is API access to OpenAI's models. So we lean heavily on what Eleuther's been putting out. Facebook's put out the OPT models. Big Science put out the Blue model, because we need to look at the weights. We need to poke around at the internals of the model, right? You can't do that. So I think that's super important. But we don't need to train them ourselves right now. Down the road, that's going to change, right? Like, the research needs change. But right now, I think there's a lot of really high impact work that can be done on open source, but pre-trained models. I think there's less, but there's still some work you can do on closed, proprietary models. So I guess, does it hinder? Yes, I think if there were the ability for everyone to train, I think we'd have a lot more people trying to compete to build better ChatGPTs. And a lot of NLP research, that's what it is can we just improve the model by trying new stuff? And for that, I think that work is being restricted a lot by the compute and just expense of training these models. But I think there's a lot of other really important work that I'm actually almost happy to see this kind of economic force people to do it, because I think that I'm more excited by work that tries to understand what's happening under the hood, and that's less compute intensive. And I think we need 1 million brains on it, because it's not an active scale, right? You need more experimental design and stuff. So I'm not super pessimistic about the immediate term. I think in the long term, we will need to make sure that all of this isn't happening through, right now we're relying on the goodwill of these nonprofit companies to release open source models and things like that. And I think that's not sustainable.
So how do you think of the role of universities versus big tech going forward? I asked Yann the same question, right? That given that, this has become a scale thing, right? Where you need tremendous resources, data, compute to do this research, right? Isn't big tech at a huge advantage, right, relative to university researchers? I guess he didn't quite think so. I'm just sort of curious what you think.
Yeah. So I'm more excited. I'm so excited about the work that my students are doing at Brown compared to the projects I'm involved in at Google, just because I think that these projects where we're focusing on smaller models, or we're trying to ask really targeted questions about how the models work under the hood, don't require all of that stuff. And I find those projects so much more exciting. I feel like I learn stuff and I am advancing my own understanding. And so I hope that other people who are confused about similar things are excited about that. And I think universities have a huge role to play in that, the basic science of it. I think the engineering of it is much harder, that the universities, people have focused on that. And I think that has historically been what a lot of NLP does. And it's been super valuable. And I think we're seeing this shift right now.
Interesting. That scale isn't the major bottleneck in doing basic research in AI.
Well, I always think of I think of why I prefer to be at a university and doing research. And I always think of kind of the, romantic view of what academia is it's you do long time horizon, high risk, low chance of success, high risk, high reward, basic science, basic research, right? That's what universities are for. If it had commercial, we live in a capitalist society, the commercial stuff gets taken over by companies, right? So if I think a similar model you might think of is something like drug research, right? University labs are working on understanding diseases and things like that pharmaceutical companies don't have as much interest in, because they're well, we need to bring it to market in some time horizon. Once a thing has suddenly a huge commercial advantage to do it, companies take it over. And that's kind of the natural life cycle of R&D, I think, right? So I think what's just hard right now is NLP is at the first time ever, this point in this life cycle. I actually know, I guess it's happened before with like information retrieval. And actually information retrieval, you've seen this happen, like people who work on information retrieval in academia have had to pivot quite a bit because IR has been very successful, right? We have these great search engines. So those conferences that used to be huge, like IR used to take up a ton of what was presented at NLP. It's shrunk dramatically. People shift to other things. And honestly, they shifted to other things that are now completely taking over. So I think that there's a little bit of growing pain as labs have to shuffle around and figure out what their new niches, but it's actually a huge success of the academic research of the past that we're now seeing it kind of go to market, and then people can start focusing on stuff that will probably not go to market for another 30 to 50 years, right? But I think it's okay, and it's good for technology to shift from being basic science to being commercial R&D. And I think it's a privilege that in academia we get to work on those things that are super long time horizon, right? Like that's kind of why I think we work here and not at companies, right?
I thought we worked here because we were misfits.
Well, that too, yeah. Because we prefer to make less money. Yeah. Right.
So Ellie, do you think about the risks at all associated with this technology? Right, that's really front and center these days, right? Everyone's talking about risks. I've certainly been talking about risks for a long time. I still don't feel like I have my head totally around it. But, coming back to Hinton, right, one of the things he said was, I'm paraphrasing, there's very few examples of a less intelligent species controlling a more intelligent one, which
Did you see there were some pretty funny rebuttals I saw to that that got fairly political.
Like you mean like politicians or things like that, right?
Yeah.
So I thought that was like really well put, right? A less intelligent species controlling more intelligent one. So I asked ChatGPT this question.
And what did it say?
I said, are there examples? Are there cases? Well, it sort of made a valiant effort. It said some reasonable things. It said, the less intelligent species could be stronger physically or politically, right? So that's one thing. Or it could exploit vulnerabilities in the code of the more intelligent machine, which I didn't quite buy. So I pushed back against that, saying, well, if it's more intelligent, then it'll fix the vulnerabilities. It knows how to code really well. And then the third thing it said was if it has access to resources or information that more intelligent species doesn't have, and then I pushed back on each of these. And it ended with, you're right. There's not much of a chance of the less intelligent species controlling a more intelligent one. So like Hinton, I don't know whether this is even possible, right? Whether it's already out of control. Do you think about it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think a lot about risks. I mean, I don't love all this discussion is about like intelligence. I don't like the idea that intelligence is like this rank order thing, right? Like I think even like, and maybe this is like a bias out of people like to think that this is the case, like, oh, who's the most intelligent person in the room or something, and we know that it's quite multifaceted, and there's not just like you can't just say yes, person A is smarter than person B. It's like person A is good at some things that person B isn't, and person B is good at other things. So I would imagine something like that being very much the case. So it kind of depends on in what domain you're competing, and in that domain, who is better, smarter, more equipped, whatever. But I think, yes, I guess the more general question of just thinking about the risks. I mean, I definitely think about it a lot. I think I don't really put myself as like a doomsdayer in the way that I think there's a lot of discussion around these kinds of existential threats. But I do think that there's super real risks that we should be thinking about, right? There might one day be existential threats. I think we'll have a lot of warning signs before we get there, but we should be paying attention to those warning signs, and especially the there's going to be all of these much smaller risks that aren't like mass extinction of humanity, but are still bad things that we don't want to have happen, right? Like security breaches, kind of national security things, and even just like financial damage to people. Like there's, privacy risks. There's
Yeah,
all of these kinds of
impersonation, fraud, all that kind of
yeah.
stuff.
There's
Yeah.
all kinds of things. So I think there's just really risks we should be taking very seriously. I personally am not comfortable with these things being widely deployed yet, right? Like I think it's like, I mean, when did ChatGPT get released? It's been like less than a year, right? And
Yeah, like 6 months, I think.
yeah, right.
If
And
if
it's right. And the scientists who know it best admit that we do not know how it, like, we don't know why it works, right? So to me, it's absurd that people are talking about using this to replace whole sectors of, whole labor sectors, like, oh, we can start using it, we can like deploy it across businesses and all these things. I don't think that's really happened yet, but people are really talking about it, right? There's God knows how many startups saying they're going to use generative AI to do this, that, and the other. And there's a lot of companies thinking seriously about whether they should do it because of like fear of missing out, right? They're worried that their competitors are going to do it and they're going to become irrelevant because they didn't jump on. So I get very nervous about the idea that this thing becomes super widespread. Everyone's putting generative AI into every nook and cranny of their business. And then we figure out that there are some problems. And at this point, the thing is like, to make a terrible analogy, this cancer that has spread to every corner of society, right? Like it's really hard to then undo it. So I think like the technology itself, I'm like, it's not like I'm worried that like OpenAI is going to double the size of the model and then we're going to be looking at like mass extinction because we didn't catch a sudden drop in the loss curve in time or something. Like I'm not really worried about that reality, but I am worried about it being widely deployed. And I think there's a lot of risks that we just do not understand well enough and then we're not really equipped to combat, right? So I think it's a serious concern. I think it's more just we should all just take a beat and figure out what we're doing before start putting everywhere. But I think the concern is that there's economic pressures and people don't like to take a beat, right? Like it's a collective action problem.
Did you sign that letter, by the way, asking to stop development?
I didn't. I thought about it and I still think about it. Like I agreed very much with the sentiment. And then I think sometimes there's like it wasn't clear exactly, like there's kind of the asks seemed a bit unrealistic and not super implementable. And I feel like sometimes there's this risk of like trying to do something and then not doing it right. And then you get this exhaustion with that kind of thing. Of course, it's not like my name on it would have made a difference. It had the effect it had. But then I think we need something like that, but that probably wasn't the right letter. And I feel like every time you do one of these things, then people are gonna be like, oh, it's another one of these things. They don't do anything. Like there's like only a fixed appetite for this type of stuff. So once again, with the not trying to rush stuff, like I think we also can't rush the policy, and there's like a PR aspect to it too, right? There's just a lot to take in.
Yeah, it is. It is. Personally, I feel it's a little late, and that to do that, and that we're maybe better off thinking about the consequences of what we built already.
Right. It didn't seem realistic. Like people aren't gonna pause. Right.
Yeah. So, Ellie, before we wrap up here, you must get young people coming to you all the time for advice. How should I be thinking about my career? And, I don't know if you're finding this to be the case in Brown, but I'm sensing sort of heightened anxiety among a lot of students, that people are just generally seem more anxious. They seem
totally
much more chilled out 20, 30 years ago than they do now. How do you advise them? How do you tell them to think about their future?
It's so hard, right? Because I do not envy being a college student right now. Like I think the generation has had it so hard to begin with, right? Like they're just coming out of a wacky world anyway. And I think especially in people in computer science, like I have a lot of students and they're very anxious. There's this kind of like, I feel like things are happening and it's important and I should be doing something and I don't know how to do something and I don't even, like, especially if they're getting close to graduating, it's like, oh, I felt like I take all these classes and I didn't and I still don't know any of the things I need to know. Like, I think, which is, I think, anxiety everyone has before graduating, but I think is heightened now. And I honestly, I wish I had good advice. I don't have great advice, except that, like, I think everyone's feeling that way. So I think there's one thing that students tend to think that, like, they're in the unique position. I think, like, social media and media in general does little to communicate this, right? It's like they kind of make it seem like there's this group of people and they totally have their shit together, pardon my French, and they're running the world and, like, everyone else is along for the ride, when actually I think that's not the case. Like, even if you talk to people who arguably are in this group of people who have their shit together and are, like, at these big tech companies and are training models, they have this exact same amount of anxiety. Like, I have not met a single person, even the person who pushes the button to train ChatGPT or whatever, and they don't feel like they're the ones who, like, are right. So I think that that there's some, I don't know if that's reassuring, but at least helps that it's like, it's not just you. And then I think a general just healthy approach right now is, like, being a little opportunistic and being adaptive, right? So paying attention to what's going on, not feeling like you have to have a 10-year plan, but, like, looking for, like, things that are exciting and where you can be useful in the immediate term. And I think that what'll happen, especially for the current generation, is, like, the world is changing so much, and the people who are kind of there, like, there's not perfect people for any of the jobs that we're going to need, right? So it's like people who are there and willing to learn on site will end up actually having a lot of influence in those sectors, right? I've talked to some students about this in the kind of tech policy area, right? Like, thinking about regulations and stuff around this. A ton of businesses are like, they want people who will help them figure out when and how and why to use generative AI. Like, no one is trained for that position, but people could definitely fit that position if they're kind of open-minded and adaptable. So I think this generation will end up having this huge impact, even if they don't feel particularly prepared to have it.
Yeah, I can understand the anxiety. On the other hand, the way I sort of respond is that you're entering a world with amazing possibilities. I mean, when I look at, like, let's say PhD students coming to data science, I'm like, wow, I'm so envious. You're getting to this field that is at an amazing stage. It used to be so much slower to make progress. But I guess I feel like that in general, that, the sort of set of opportunities for people have really opened up, but I can see how that could also cause anxiety.
I think there's this anxiety where I think this false perception that there's these opportunities, but they're for people who are not whoever is coming to you for talent, right? They feel like they're not smart enough, they don't have the right training, and so other people are doing this and they are not those people, but actually they are those people. I think that's part of it's like a classic imposter syndrome-ish type of thing. It's almost like a
self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So I think that it would be nice to have, like, I think there's a little sometimes. So I talked about how CS has this great, really welcoming culture. I do feel like that's broken down a bit with this new AI, which has made me sad, where there's this, like, I see a lot of bad communication around AI, which I think is, there's some incentive to feel really smart and to make sure people know how smart you are by working on this. And I think that has been successful, where people are like, oh, in order to do this stuff, you have to be really smart. And I think that's doing us a disservice, right? Because a lot of people are just, like, worried that, like, oh, if I have, like, I've had a lot of people say, like, what, I haven't taken that much math. The truth is, you don't need really any math to train ChatGPT, and, like, the people who are telling you that they, like, do Taylor series expansions on the daily are, like, it's not really true, right? Like, of course you should take math. Math is a great thing to do. But if people are getting stuck and they're worried that they can't contribute to what's going on in the world until they've got, like, multiple graduate degrees in math, then that's filtering out a whole ton of people who actually would have a ton to contribute.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, in fact, I have people come and say, "Oh, I don't have a good background in programming." I was like, "Well, then learn it."
Right.
It's learnable. So, and
totally
it's never too
learnable.
late, right? And as you said, you got into computing in your early 20s, right? So
totally.
It's never too late.
Yeah, totally. It's never too late. Yeah, totally.
Well, Ellie, this has been fascinating. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
This was a lot of fun. This was great.
Thanks for making the time. Really enjoyed it. And
absolutely.
Really happy to do this. So thanks so much again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was great.